To watch all of my exclusive content not featured here on my channel, log on to my website at imjustheretomake.com/films. Throughout today's society of America, the process of education is based solely on the credence to that which is most popular by public opinion, rather than which would be truthful by way of logical and critical thinking. Compulsory school curriculums in history, for example, derives from fabricated folk tales that were authorized by manipulative social engineers of the 19th century. And their opinions alone are somehow credible and are unmolestedly deemed as historical facts without being constructively criticized or even publicly challenged for validation and accuracy. It's as if people now concluded that if something can be believed by the masses, then they should just tag along and follow the crowd and believe it too. But how did we, as a people, allow our history to be written solely on the basis of a stranger's opinion or by popular belief? Why would these strangers have a right, or even the knowledge for that matter, to tell the stories of our actual history here in America, when the truth is, those strangers were not living here with our indigenous ancestors to bear witness to any account to begin with? Now, I want you all to think about the very first time that you have ever heard of the term slavery, and try to recall what you were told about the so-called slave ships amongst these slave stories. Many of you can recall hearing information given to you concerning the slave ships themselves, deriving from third-party sources and maybe not your school initially. But that's very important to note, because we must now ask, where did these third-party sources retrieve their information about the slave ships in general? These third parties are things like books and movies and even the media that tends to give their cultivated possible descriptions of these so-called slave ships based merely on their perception of what they consider to be a fact, based on information taught by a stranger, or rather by someone else's opinion. For example, fictional movies like 12 Years a Slave and Armistead, then the resurfacing of the story surrounding Clotilda, which was allegedly found and deemed as the last American slave ship, just like the Wanderer, which was also deemed as the last American slave ship. But yet, there are no viable remains of either ship or boat, just a story, in order to keep the idealism of slavery afloat. What all of these third-party sources have in common is that their stories tends to lead to a dead end when researching any publicly verifiable evidence to validate their claims made, along with validating their depictions of what a slave ship actually is. So, what's a depiction? A depiction is an old French word that is defined as a portrayal in picture or a representation in words, a portrait. What is also very important to note here is that by creating a portrait or a portrayal of a depiction, it does not have to be accurate. It is just meant to show a generalized likeness or an idea of something by way of imagination that is agreed upon. According to an 18th century painter and the founder of the Society of Arts, Sir Joshua Reynolds stated that, quote, "In portraits, the grace, and we may add, the likeness consists more in the general air than in the exact similitude of every feature." So, what does all of this have to do with the existence of slave ships? Well, that's the point. There were no official slave ships, nor were there any ships created for the intended purpose to carry only slaves. These depictions that were mysteriously given to us about these ships manipulated the mind into believing that there were actual slave ships that existed, when in reality, there is no hard evidence to support this heavily campaigned theory. In fact, you will not find any colonial documentation that would use the term slave ship to describe their passenger ships, cargo ships, merchant vessels, or warships. This means that these stories of slave ships are contradicting themselves, because these ships were actually wooden sailboats that did not include utilitarian motors as a convenience. These motorless sailboats were originally known as rowboats that were called skiffs, dories, and wherries that were chiefly propelled by the use of sails and oars for navigating the boat even through tumultuous seas, violent winds, and unexpected climate changes. Between the 1500s and the 1800s, these rowboats were used for many things, like trading goods, or for the transportation of goods, exploration, pirateering, and of course, immigration. But just not those stories of immigration that most of you are accustomed to hearing about. And here's what I mean by that. Just imagine a school of people cramming themselves onto a boat today, trying drastically to avoid what's known as immigration laws, packing themselves in the trunks of vehicles, and even small cave-like holes underneath the ground, doing whatever it takes to travel to America, due to their belief that America is the land of plenty, with new beginnings for themselves and their families, opportunities for employment and affordable housing, all while risking their lives in hopes of gaining freedom. This should all ring a bell here and make you wonder if people were willing or unwilling to aboard these rowboats or cargo passenger ships in the first place. Or maybe the question should be, were people forced into slavery, or was slavery simply done by choice? Now, before I go any further, I want you to note again that during the 1600s and until the near end of the 1800s, rowboats or cargo ships were not modernized to include engines or motors that would conveniently drive the boat throughout the seas. The commercial production of steamboats or riverboats were made available at the tail end of the 1800s as well, which should make you wonder, how many so-called slave ships were accounted for that enabled strangers to carry a whopping 12.5 million people, along with supplies, food, and other cargo from one continent to another? And if there were no motors or engines attached to these slave ships, then some company or fictionalized character would have been created and placed up for public display by now in order to showcase how an impossible task of dragging millions of people out of their native lands and forcing them to work on some distant land is somehow a reality, and it actually happened. But I guess since slavery was so bad that it's no need to prove that these slave ships actually existed, right? Now, let's take things a step further. As you may know, this type of travel was extremely perilous during the time periods prior to any advanced technologies allowing for more propitious routes to be taken. Merchants or sailors traveling across the Atlantic using sailboats had no choice but to take specific routes based on the Volta do Mar Largo, which is a Portuguese phrase meaning turn of the wide sea. This Volta do Mar Largo phrase refers to the oceanic rotation that signifies the ocean's currents, which is why we are taught that the sea is divided into 5 oceans. These 5 oceans are also called ocean gyres, in which each of these gyres represents a different ocean current rotation. Listen closely. According to the National Geographic, the North Atlantic Gyre begins with the northward flow of the Gulf Stream along the east coast of the United States. The Gulf Stream is the western boundary current of the gyre. The gyre then becomes the North Atlantic Current, which flows across the North Atlantic to Europe. Still flowing in a circular pattern, the current flows south as far as northwestern coast of Africa, where it is known as the Canary Current, the gyre's eastern boundary current. The gyre is completed as the North Atlantic Equatorial Current crosses the Atlantic Ocean to the Caribbean Sea. This entire circle and the water within it is the North Atlantic Gyre." End quote. As I've stated numerous times before, this means that only the winds and the currents of the ocean could determine how a boat or a ship was able to travel across the Atlantic, revealing the true reason why explorers initially sailed to South America instead of North America first. Also, the winds and the climate made trading and traveling across the ocean very time-consuming, resulting in slowly paced travels that will require several weeks and even months to reach a single destination, yet alone a round trip, all while hoping that the captain sailor has the ability to stay on course. And by the way, this also exposes that these ships were not able to literally travel straight across from one continent to another, due merely to the ocean's current, which can be compared to a game of double dutch, since inexperienced and even senior sailors had to jump in these gyres at the right times or they would lose. They were also limited to just having a compass for direction and the use of their hands to tell time, or rather how much daylight was left, by aligning their fingers with the horizon. All of this sounds difficult, doesn't it? According to the Royal Museums of Greenwich, life at sea during the Age of Sail was filled with hardship. Sailors had to accept cramped conditions, disease, poor food and pay, and bad weather. So, if the sailors had to endure famine for weeks and even months, no pay and no work, sicknesses and diseases, treacherous weather climates, and even cramped living conditions, then how would anyone be able to control, feed, and successfully keep alive hundreds to thousands of so-called slaves that were allegedly captured from Africa and packed like sardines below the deck of their sailboats? Many people died for attempting this voyage, making it extremely difficult to even keep the same crew for more than one seafaring trip across the Atlantic. So in hopes of immediately providing a safer passage by learning the hard way, capacity stipulations were forced on the sizes of cargo and the passengers aboard. But these treacherous conditions continued to plague the foreigners for centuries, making it unrealistic to transport millions of so-called slaves from one continent to another between the early 1600s to the late 1800s across the Atlantic. This is why you would not find any historical evidence nor colonial documentation of a transatlantic slave trade during this time period. That task would be simply impossible for anyone to accomplish, especially the way that we were taught how the story goes. So, what is a slave ship? And what can be logically concluded by critical thinking as to what was originally meant by the use of this term? First, the origin of the term slave ship allegedly traces back to the English noun slaver, which made a public appearance in the dictionary entitled Walker and Webster Combined in a Dictionary of the English Language, which was published in the year of 1877. However, what's important to note is that the term slaver was defined during this time period as saliva running from the mouth, and the closest word that had derogatory meaning of this kind in regards to the word slaver was the term slaverer, which was defined as an idiot during this time period, interesting enough. Second, the definition of the term slave ship was never historically documented before. In fact, the word was just recently created and made its way into school curriculums and books well over 100 years later, around the mid-1980s. Did you know that you would not find the term slave ship in any English dictionary prior to the 1980s? Which forces an individual to define this non-existing term by complete speculation surrounding the two words that it is comprised of, slave and ship. In the year 1828, the word slave was defined as one who has lost the power of resistance, or who surrenders himself to any power, whatever, a mean person, one in the lowest state of life. And the word ship derives from the Latin word scapha and the Saxon word sapien, which means to create form or build. And so over time, the perception of this depiction of a slave ship is based on a particular portrayal in picture and representation in words, which has been clouded by the idea of conceptualism, deriving from the basis of conceptual art. According to the College of Central Florida, conceptual art is based on the notion that the essence of art is an idea or concept and may exist distant from and in the absence of an object as its representation. That is because the job of the mind is to create an object where there is none. It goes on to state that conceptualism began in the first half of the 20th century, not as an artistic movement, but as a philosophy, a questioning of what was taken for granted. In the year 1926, a film entitled Anemic Cinema was created by painter, sculptor, philosopher, and filmmaker Henry Robert Marcel Duchamp, who was an immigrant from France that eventually migrated to the United States. Duchamp is well known in the arts as a conceptualist, being as though he was famous for creating the term ready-mades. In a 1975 article in reference to Duchamp's film and his works in regards to conceptualism, author Katrina Martin of Studio International wrote that Duchamp's ready-mades can be simply defined as, quote, an object which has been taken out of context, which is in any way conventional and placed into a new and strange one, whereby the function of the object chosen changes radically. So in other words, the idea of a slave ship was meant to create a visual and a written concept so that a person's mind could conceive a totally different picture of what was being stated, represented, or displayed. So a person's mind would radically imagine changed portraits or visions altogether of what a slave ship could be mentally, based solely on allowing our minds to combine the definitions of a slave and ship inadvertently. Now, if you combine the definition of ship alongside the definition of slave without the use of conceptualism, then we can determine that the term ship was used as a suffix in this sense, being as though it was added to the end of the word slave in order to strictly create a relationship between these two words. I'm just here to make you think.